Hello and welcome to this Election 2013 special on Sky News. We're talking on this election eve to the former Prime Minister, John Howard. Welcome.
Hello, David.
I want to take you back, firstly, to 1996.
I remember it well.
Yes. The polls then, as they are today, were showing that the coalition was on track for victory. How confident were you, though? Did you feel you had it in the bag the day before the election?
No, I didn't. I was very nervous. I didn't believe the polls. I suppose after a long time in opposition and a number of setbacks, it was hard to believe that I was going to win. I remember on the day, as I visited polling booths, I kept calculating that we would win just a few seats, which would just get us over the line. Now, I had no idea then of the scale of the win we finally had with a big majority.
You would honestly look at a poll in the days before the election,
and I would disbelieve
and you would disbelieve it.
Yeah, I would, and I would think that something would go wrong, and that is a perfectly natural thing. Now, the polls at the moment indicate the coalition's going to win, but you never know, and there's a bit of a concern I have that there will be a drift away to minor parties from some people who can't bring themselves to vote for Labor again, but don't like us. Now, the only thing I'd say to them is that if you really want to change, then the only way to do it is to come right over and not muck around with independents.
Well, just getting back to your period as opposition leader, on and off, you were opposition leader for quite a lengthy period.
I had two bits. I had 3.5 years, then I got sidelined, and then I came back just under 6 years later and had a year or more in the lead up to the 96 election.
Well, Tony Abbott has been opposition leader for, I think, nearly 4 years. So it's a long time in a tough job, and he's done it well. I don't think too many dispute that. But the transition from that job to being Prime Minister, how difficult is that?
Well, it is difficult. And if Tony wins tomorrow, and we've got to wait and see if he does, he'll have one big advantage. He'll bring a lot of experience. He will actually have had more ministerial experience than any of his 4 Labor predecessors, Rudd, Gillard, Keating and Hawke, more ministerial experience.
Because only Paul Keating out of that list
He had 3 weeks as a minister for Northern Development in the Whitlam government. Now, I'm not saying this is the sole criterion. I have always acknowledged that amongst Labor Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke did a good job. It's not the sole criterion.
But the difference between being opposition leader, even if you've been a minister previously, and then taking the top job as Prime Minister...
It's a huge transition, but Tony's got the experience. He's got high intelligence. Nobody should ever underestimate his intelligence. Amongst my cabinet colleagues, there was no better read member of that cabinet than Tony Abbott. And he's got a breadth of knowledge and understanding, which is quite important in the nation's top job. He's not just narrowly focused with his intelligence. He's got a terrific sense of humour, and for an Australian Prime Minister, potentially he has one other great quality: he doesn't take himself too seriously.
Now, your first couple of years as Prime Minister, I think it's fair to say, were your most politically difficult. What do you put that down to?
Well, we tried to do a lot of big things. Our first budget was in many respects our very best budget because it laid the foundation, because of the tightness we applied to it, laid the foundation for later years. A lot of people make the mistake of looking back on our term in government and saying, oh, they just got the benefit of the China boom. China boom didn't come until 6 years after we'd been elected. We did a lot of heavy lifting in those early years without the benent of the China boom.
But you had political difficulties as well.
Oh, we had political difficulties. We had one nation, and of course, in the '98 election, we bared our policy souls and took the GST.
So you did courageous things in those early days. The spending cuts, the GST, for example. Is Tony Abbott going to follow a similar path?
Look, Tony Abbott will run a different government from the one I ran. There will be a lot of similarities because we come from the same political stable. But as he rightly said, if he becomes Prime Minister, and it's still an if, he won't run the 5th term of the Howard government. He'll run the 1st term of the Abbott government. And I admire Tony a lot and I like him a lot, as everybody knows, but he will do a number of things differently and he'll have some different priorities, but he will look after the money of the nation. He will be careful with the taxpayers' money and he'll bring a willingness to listen to the electorate, which is a very important thing for a Prime Minister.
Should an incoming Prime Minister be a bit bolder when it comes to looking after the books, do some of the things that you did, spending cuts, for example? And I know Labor's made a fair bit of this as well during the campaign, and pointing out that you did things you said you wouldn't do. You made cuts in university and health spending, and these weren't flagged prior to the election in '96. Is this the sort of thing that Tony Abbott will necessarily have to do?
No, look, Tony Abbott will do what he said he's going to do. I've observed him very carefully, both when we were in government as a minister and since he's been opposition leader. When Tony says he's going to do something, he'll do it. And he'll be careful to observe his commitments. Like all Prime Ministers, there'll be some things that come along that nobody can expect. But and the plan he's laid out on the budget is superior to Labor's. I mean, there are greater savings, there is a commitment, and he has the track record to point to. There's no doubt that this current Labor government has wasted taxpayers' money.
But Tony Abbott's plans are hugely different in the overall spending over 4 years.
Well, $6 billion is not to be sneezed at.
But a $400 billion annual budget.
Yeah, but he's also going to get rid of some growth-destroying taxes. And that will help a great deal. One of the things that the next government of Australia has got to do is to pursue growth, because if you get more economic growth, that helps to cure the budget problem. It's not the only thing. I mean, in the United States at the moment, the budget deficit problem is being significantly eroded, or reduced rather, by greater economic activity, which is producing greater revenues.
When we look at his spending plans, of course there are savings measures there, but there are big spending measures as well. I mean, the paid parental leave is the signature policy, as he calls it. I mean, that's $5.5 billion a year. Is that the sort of thing you would have done?
Well, when we looked at this, we came to a different conclusion, but that was 6 years ago. And as I said earlier, we have to see Tony Abbott very much as his own man, with his own priorities within the broad embrace of the Liberal approach. And
does this fit within the Liberal approach?
Well, he sees this very much as a workforce participation measure.
Do you?
Well, I think for a section of the population, it will certainly be more attractive to balancing family and work responsibilities.
Is it good for the country, though?
Well, anything that improves workforce participation has to be an economic plus.
Is this policy good for the country?
Well, improving workforce participation is good for the country. Yes.
But is this policy good for the country?
Well, it will improve workforce participation, ergo it's good for the country.
You mentioned that things have to be done when you're elected to government, and often things may not be what you thought they were going to be prior to the election. You used the phrase core and non-core promises. Do you think that will necessarily have to apply? Should Tony Abbott?
I don't think it was the brightest phrase I ever used when I was in government. The point I was simply making is that in any election campaign, there are some things that are higher on the totem pole than others. That's really what I meant by that. It's not that you should ever disrespect a commitment that you have made to the election.
So there are some things you take to the election that
there was a big. I mean, there was a bit of a difference. In '96, we had the situation where the Labor Party were running around, Mr Keating and Mr Beazley were running around saying, well, there's no budget problem at all. Now it's a little different this time. We do know there's an issue, and therefore the black hole was there all the time, although they said it wasn't.
Because Tony Abbott has said during this campaign that if things are worse than he realises when he gets in, he'll still keep all of his promises and push back the return to surplus if necessary further into the distance. Is that the right approach, or should you be willing to?
I think that is an issue where, once again, I've got to say, he will be the Prime Minister.
But see, your approach was a bit different, wasn't it?
Yes, but the circumstances are different. I mean, 17 years ago, and you have to.
But the budget's in worse shape now. Isn't it?
Well, I don't know. We had $96 billion back 17 years ago. It was and we hadn't had it had been. We had a lot of economic difficulties, and there are a lot of rigidities in the economy. I mean, a lot of them now have been brought back by this government. I acknowledge that, but it's very difficult to make precise comparisons between 1996 and 2013. But I'll just go back to my, dare I say, core point, and that is that Tony Abbott will look after the people's money carefully. It's part of the Liberal tradition to be careful with taxpayers' money and always to err on the side of caution. That was one of the reasons why we left behind such an enormous bank balance for Mr Rudd, which he pretty quickly got rid of.
Getting back to Tony Abbott, the man, the politician, how is he similar to you and how is he different?
Well, we both have a Liberal tradition. We both have elements of social conservatism in each other. How is he different? Well, he's 18 years younger than I am, and he had perhaps a somewhat slightly different background. He grew up in a professional family background. I grew up in a small business background. Perhaps we're struggling to highlight both differences and similarities. Tony is a very engaging, humorous, likeable person. I prefer to talk about his qualities or his characteristics rather than struggle over drawing comparisons. We agree on a lot of things, but we disagree on other things. And I know you want a list of all the things we disagree on, but and I'm not really in the business of doing that. But that is natural. I mean, Paul Keating and Bob Hawke were two Labor figures from the past. They worked together very closely.
Everybody's different.
Everybody's different, and it's not good to sort of try too hard to say how much the next Prime Minister of Australia might be like a former Prime Minister of Australia. We are all very different. Fraser was very different from Menzies. Holt was very different from Menzies. I was very different from Fraser. Keating was different from Hawke. And if Tony does win, and he hasn't won yet, and shouldn't get carried away with hubris. If he does win, and he's given this incredible privilege, he'll do things in his own way, but it will be consistent with, a straight line of commitment to caring for taxpayers' money, providing choice for people, respecting the importance of small business, and the role of the family in our society.
One of the first things he'll have to do is put together his front bench lineup.
Yes.
Now, I won't ask you to name names of who he should put where.
I shall avoid any temptation.
Let me ask you in a general sense, is that the point when you first get the job to make significant change? Does it get harder the longer you're in office to juggle your front bench around?
Well, one of the good things that Tony's got, he's got plenty of talent to draw from, and another extraordinary thing about this campaign is that you've had a constancy and a steadiness in the coalition team. It just struck me earlier today that the two most prominent members of the Labor government of the last 3 years are totally absent in this campaign, and that's Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan. Yet the prominent people on our side have been there in the same places, same time, right through. So he will come into office with some familiar faces, with plenty of experience around him. So they'll be able to take over the reins of government if they do get the majority support. Clearly the people who you put in at the beginning are very important. I mean, I attribute a lot of the stability of my government to the fact that I think for the only time since Federation, the three people occupying the Prime Ministership, the Treasury and Foreign Affairs were the same for more than 10 years, myself, Peter Costello and Alexander Downer. And that gave
you saw that as a key strength?
Oh, an enormous strength. Because there was a predictability and a constancy. And one of the terrible characteristics of the Labor government in the last 6 years is that it's been unstable. People haven't felt that and even if they're a bit uncomfortable with what a government does, they like to have a government that is stable and is getting on with the job, and there's never been that feeling from this government.
But when Tony Abbott has to sit down and think about his front bench, as you know, there's a lot of young, talented Liberals who are very keen on promotion.
All young, talented people, Liberal, Labor or National Party are keen on promotion. I was when I first went into Parliament.
Was your approach that they all needed to serve their time, that it was best to keep them in the tent or outside the tent?
It varies according to personalities. I mean, for example, one of the people that I put in a cabinet position immediately was John Fahey. He hadn't been in federal parliament, but he'd been the Premier of New South Wales. So obviously the idea of saying, well, you've got to have a couple of years on the back bench is ridiculous. It depends a lot on the circumstances. But the great luxury, if I can put it that way, Tony will have if he wins, is that he's got a lot of people to draw on, and he's got some well-known people like Julie Bishop, Scott Morrison, and so forth, and obviously Joe Hockey. They've been around, and they're now real identities in the community. People have seen a lot of them, and they've seen them in the same position. So
I think that they'll all be okay. But is your advice to him, if you'd give him advice on this, get the best team at the start?
Well, that's
even if it means upsetting a few people.
Well, look, if Tony seeks my advice, I'll give it to him and I'll keep it private.
What about, if you could share advice on dealing with the Nationals?
About the Nationals?
Dealing with the Nationals in coalition. I mean, you...
Well, it's very important that the Nationals in the coalition be treated with full respect. Because it's not easy to be the junior partner in a coalition.
And there are issues where
there are always some issues, but one of the many ingredients of our success in government was that I had three fantastic men to work with as Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fischer, John Anderson and Mark Vaile. And sure, there are differences, and every so often in a coalition the junior partner has got to be seen to have some policy success and some distinctive policy preference. That's the nature of a coalition, but the modern National Party and the modern Liberal Party have very similar economic views and very, very similar views on national security.
I want to ask you about Labor's prospects. I mean, you know, the election is tomorrow. We don't know what the result is, but the polls all indicate that Labor is in deep trouble, and Kevin Rudd might even be in trouble in his own seat of Griffith. Now, as someone who lost your own seat as Prime Minister, what was that like, losing Bennelong as the government went out?
Well, I had, by 2007, I had a marginal seat in Bennelong. I held Bennelong by 4.1%. Kevin Rudd holds Griffith by double that amount. So it really is, on the normal order of things, a safe seat. Well, I didn't like it. I didn't like losing the election, but it happened. And in the end, I would imagine that my contribution to Australian politics will be judged on what I did while I was there rather than the particular circumstances of my severance arrangement. But the Liberal Party's now got an excellent member in Bennelong in John Alexander, and I think he'll win with an increased majority.
But looking at the way Prime Ministers over, well, I guess some decades now have finished their time as Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, yourself, Paul Keating, Bob Hawke, Malcolm Fraser, none of them end on their own terms.
No, I think the only one who has is Sir Robert Menzies, and but that's the nature of Margaret Thatcher, who I have the most remarkable regard for. She was pushed out by her own party. Bob Hawke was pushed out by his own party, but that's just the nature of politics, and you have to accept when you go into politics that it might end roughly. But that's the democratic process. In the end, you are judged by what you did while you held the reins of office and the impact you had on the country, not the neat or otherwise circumstances of your departure.
Can I turn to the challenges that will lie ahead for whoever wins, be it Tony Abbott or Kevin Rudd, tomorrow? Firstly, on the economy, do you think we are in a turbulent economic period globally, regionally? What should we be concerned about?
Well, we should be concerned that we are losing competitiveness. There's no doubt that the Australian economy has continued to perform better than many others, and largely due to the fact that we entered the global financial crisis in superb fiscal state. And that, may I say, was completely due to the budget management of the former government, because we left behind no net debt, budget surpluses, low unemployment, and all of those things, plus, importantly, the proximity of China and her enormous demand for our resources. Now, I think the mining boom is moderating. I think to suggest that it is completely over or about to be completely over is an exaggeration. I think it's moderating, but it will still continue to provide steady income for Australia. But we do have to worry that we're losing some of our competitiveness, and I think the government has gone too far in re-regulating the labour market, and I welcome Tony Abbott's commitment to bring it back to the sensible centre.
Is he going far enough, though?
I think, given the belief that WorkChoice made a contribution to our defeat in 2007, I think he's got the balance right. Now, you know,
would he need to go further over time?
Well, look, that's something that he will have to deal with. I'm not going to. That's a bit too far down the track. But you do need to worry about our competitiveness. We need to be concerned about growth cramping taxes, and that's why he's committed to getting rid of the mining tax and the carbon tax. So, but we have to worry in the medium term about our competitiveness. We should never assume that just because we've got the resources and China and other countries want them, that there aren't other countries that have also got the resources and will cut corners and cut more competitive deals with the Chinese and other buyers. When
we look at the global security environment at the moment, one of the big challenges is Syria. It's being thrashed out at or discussed at the G20 at the moment as well. What approach do you think the world should be taking there, and do you agree that it's baddies versus baddies, as Tony Abbott put it?
Yes, I do, and I'm just astounded that the Labor Party's taken exception to that description. There is obviously
is it a description you'd use, though?
I've used it. Other world leaders have used it. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is being pompous. Suggesting that you can't say that. There are obviously evil people on both sides. Al-Qaeda has its hooks into sections of the opposition. What I would like to hear is precisely what kind of military action is in mind and what impact will that have on the capacity of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons again.
So you're not convinced that a military strike would necessarily...
Well, I know. I've got an open mind on that. I do want to hear the nature of it. I mean, I am clearly one of those people who believes that you can't be a hostage to the Security Council of the United Nations on something like this, because all that does is to outsource your foreign policy to Russia and China, which is essentially what the Labor Party has argued in the past, although they're not arguing it at the moment, I notice, on Syria, but that's another matter.
Just before we wrap up, I want to come back to domestic politics. The attitude towards politicians these days does seem to have diminished. Would you agree with that, and why do you think it is?
I think it has to a degree, but unfairly. It's a product of the dead heat we had at the last election. Normally you have an election with a clear winner. The winner gets on and implements its policies, the opposition goes away, licks its wounds and works out what went wrong and what's got to do in the future to win. That didn't happen last time. Julia Gillard didn't win and Tony Abbott didn't lose. We effectively had a dead heat, and she put together this cosmopolitan coalition, and the opposition legitimately felt that it was for 3 years on the verge of coming into government, and therefore you did have a robust entanglement, a robust engagement for 3 years, and people probably...
So you think this
I mean, the best thing that can happen...
has a clear win.
The best thing that can happen tomorrow is that we have a clear outcome. and we're not hobbled by independents and minor parties and so forth. People have a right to vote for them. It's a democracy, but we really do need, and if you don't like the government, vote for the coalition, or if you don't like the coalition, vote for the Labor Party.
But are you confident Tony Abbott will win tomorrow?
Look, I expect him to win, but I'm not going to get carried away and start predicting victories because in the end that's disrespectful to the process, and the Australian people will decide that, and whatever they decide, everybody will accept. But my last message really is that if you want an end to the last 3 years, then you need a decisive result, and you won't get that via the Greens or One Nation or Clive Palmer or Bob Katter. You'll get it either by voting for the coalition or voting for the Labor Party.
And just a final question. Do you think Labor would have done better with Julia Gillard? No,
I don't think so. I don't think Julia Gillard ever had great authority. The Labor Party made a terrible mistake getting rid of Rudd in 2010, but once they got rid of him, they sowed the seeds of the instability that if they do lose on Saturday will be the principal reason why they lose.
John Howard, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.